Welcome to our audience members from Italy, Panama, New York, all over the world. I'm Ari Goldstein, Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Legacies program with renowned architect Daniel Libeskind and architectural critic Paul Goldberger. Daniel Libeskind was born in Lodz, Poland in 1946 as the son of Holocaust survivors. Known around the world for his ability to evoke cultural memory in architecture, his projects include the Jewish Museum in Berlin, the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, who we're glad to have as a co-presenter this evening, and the master plan for the rebuilt World Trade Center here in Lower Manhattan. Paul Goldberger is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who's been called the leading figure in architectural criticism. He served as the architectural critic at The New Yorker for 14 years and is now a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, among his other projects. Paul will speak with Daniel about his life and work, and we'll save some time at the end for audience questions. So please feel free to share your questions in the Zoom chat at any time. This evening's Legacies program is made possible with a gift from Mark Kirshner in honor of Nancy Fisher. Without further ado, a very warm welcome to Daniel Libeskind and Paul Goldberger. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ari. Daniel, it's wonderful to be with you again.
Likewise, Paul.
Via Zoom. The pandemic has changed all of our lives, but architecture, of course, goes on. And all of us feel paradoxically more embedded in the physical architecture that surrounds us because we're not running all over the place as we did before. But at the same time, we're more embedded in the virtual world of technology because we live on Zoom, as you and I are doing right now. In any case, before we get into the real substance of our conversation, how has this last year been for you? Can you tell us a bit about how your studio has functioned? What has it been like not living your life on airplanes as you did for much of the last years?
Well, Paul, it's been a dramatic change in my life and the life of my work. But I've discovered, and we have all discovered, that technology really works. We are working totally remotely, and yet the architectural tools that we discovered are pretty amazing. We can work on screens in real time in large teams. So that has been sort of an amazing discovery, that technology really adapted itself to the work. And of course, I have not traveled as I used to madly around the world, but that has also proven to be good for the environment. Reduce the carbon footprint, stop useless travels, and try to concentrate on a more ecological balance in terms of living. So it's been a year of discoveries. It's, of course, there are limitations to deal with people on a screen. I miss the physical emotions that are not part of any transactions on the screen, but are just accidents. And that's, of course, I think everybody feels.
Yes, and I feel it's much easier to deal. I mean, you and I can talk comfortably on a screen because we have a reservoir of relationship, of knowing each other in the real world that we can draw on. I think it's much harder when you're meeting somebody for the first time and don't have that prior connection.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. I think even with the colleagues in our studio, just not seeing them, not having the accident that is always part of a conversation or being there is a minus, definitely.
But on the other hand, on the plus side, is it probably has been a relief to not have perpetual jet lag for you.
Well, I've discovered my home. I used to know the lounges at airports better than my own bedroom. So now that there is really something fantastic. I've discovered the idea of home in a physical way. Yes.
So there have been compensations. Yes.
Of course, absolutely.
I would think, especially even though you don't specialize in residential architecture, as an architect, to have a deeper engagement with the idea of home has to be meaningful to you. Well,
in fact, we are working on a number of residential projects, and not just luxury projects, public housing here in New York. And of course, I've always thought, but now you have the empirical example, how important every square centimeter or square inch of space really is, and that you don't need mega spaces to make life comfortable and meaningful. And I think that's really part of spending time looking at the walls, looking at the floor, looking at the window, looking what the view is. Yes.
Okay, good. I want to come back in a few minutes to talk about a couple of those New York projects, but let's move on, because I'd love to talk to you a little bit about, I mean, this is part of the Museum of Jewish Heritage series, and you're an architect whose connection to Jewish life and history are profound. As Ari reminded us all at the beginning, you're the child of Holocaust survivors. You came to the United States as a refugee, and your first built project was the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and then you've done the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco as well. So could we talk first about the role your identity as a Jew has played in the shaping of your architecture?
Well, it's fundamental, because how can you get away from who you are, where you grew up? I grew up in Poland under, a dark system of communism, of authoritarianism. I was old enough to understand the repression of freedom. And being Jewish, having parents who were survivors of the Holocaust, seeing that the city in which I was born, Łódź, which was the third largest city of Jewish population in the world, New York, Warsaw, and Łódź, which had 250,000 people, Jews, in the city I lived. When today the city has maybe 10 people who are Jewish. So if you think of 250,000 Jews disappearing from a city, 1/3 of that city was Jews. You think really that identity that is part of you and that is so deep, because it's not something you discover in a library, it's not something you read about, it's just part of your everyday world. And of course, coming to America was such an amazing experience for me as well as an immigrant. So yes, the Jewish identity, yes, that's me, definitely.
Right. Let me follow that with another question that partly emerges from that, which is there such a thing as a Jewish architecture, or is there a Jewish sensibility about architecture?
Well, I think definitely there is a Jewish sensibility. I know in Yiddish there is a word Yiddishkeit.
Yeah.
It's what is it? It's not about religion. It's not about some narrow system of who you are or some traditions. It's just meaning to be part of life. And I think this sense is a very deep sense of this particular kind of Jewishness, which I wouldn't really compare it to religion of the Jews, the state of Israel, any of those things. It's just a sense of the legacy that history of Jews has had on one's own deep framework. And I think there is such a thing as Jewish sensibility. There's no doubt. You could be a Christian or a Muslim and have a Jewish sensibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you feel that sensibility is defined as a connection to history, as a connection to a larger historical arc of time? How would you describe it?
That's a good question, Paul. I would say this, that that Jewish sensibility has to do with memory, has to do with the act of memory. Now, in a personal way, it's very strange, but it's true. My grandfather was an itinerant storyteller who went from shtetl to shtetl, a poor man who made his living by going from little village to little village in Poland and telling stories and being remunerated for telling these stories. And I always thought, that architecture is actually, despite the fact that its structure and gravity and all those things, is a storytelling profession. Because if a building is good, it tells you something, it tells you a story. And I always think, even the stupidest, most banal, glass building that has really zero character tells you a story. It's a very short story, which says, I have nothing to tell you, but it's a story. It's a story. It's it's Beckett, So I've always thought, yes, that's part of the Jewish sensibility. The story that embeds itself in memory and that can be passed on and that has a longevity that goes beyond the time in which it is told.
I love the idea of the the city of glass buildings as being a city of no stories, in effect.
Yeah.
You cannot tell its stories somehow, or a city of muteness, because there is a kind of muteness sometimes, isn't there?
Definitely. I mean, we live in many cities, cities of amnesia, where we don't have any to remember, when there is nothing to orient us to something bigger than our own egos, where we walk through sort of a meaningless, consolidation of structure that has very little impact on our soul. And I think when we talked about the Jewish sensibility, I think it's about being with people. It's about a soul. It's not about transactions. It's not about ideology. It's about the sense of communion with people of all sorts, and being able to live together in a meaningful way. I think that is that sensibility.
Daniel, much of what you're saying could be an argument for historic preservation, could be an argument for keeping older buildings in a city, and showing what Lewis Mumford very memorably referred to as the visibility of time, when he said, in a city, time becomes visible. But your own work, of course, is not historical at all. It's in fact quite assertively modern and different from what has come before. Can you sort of reflect on that a little bit, on how designing buildings that are very different in a way connects to the past or evokes the past?
Well, most of the buildings I've built have been with historical buildings. My first building, the Jewish Museum Berlin, is together, using a Baroque building. Right. My museum in San Francisco is the oldest power station of electricity in San Francisco. That was part of the remit. All the museums, none of them are in a sort of standing as in a free site. They're always part of the historical context. And I have great love for the historical context. I'm not an architect who tries to get rid of the historical context. On the contrary, I try to have a dialogue and not accept the historical context as some sort of inert sculpture of the past that has no meaning anymore, but engage it, sometimes in a very radical way, by cutting into it, by bringing it forward, by transforming its backgroundness into foregroundness. So yes, I think I would not be appreciative of architects who don't like history and who don't enjoy the importance of the context that you so eloquently just spoke about in quoting Mumford.
Well, I think the most important thing that you do in terms of your attitude toward history is to say that engaging with history does not mean mimicking it. You don't.
Exactly. It's true. I think I'm not nostalgic or sentimentalist about the history, but I think that history, whatever it is, whether it's the Baroque building in Berlin, whether it's the Grand Library in Denmark, in Copenhagen, where the Jewish Museum is, whether it's the site in Dresden, which has a military history museum built, in the 19th century. Every single building that I've built really engages. And I think that depth of engagement is my love for memory. Because memory, unless it is really engaged in, becomes just forgettable. We don't really even think about it. So to engage memory physically, viscerally, spiritually, is really to bring back that memory. And I think his architecture without memory would be not only amnesia, but would create just objects that are formalistic, but have really very little impact on our lives and on our future.
I mean, for me, if we think about something like the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, which is one of your projects I most admire,
thank you.
In that discourse, even though it sometimes seems like one that is not, let's say, not without its stresses, but it's in that discourse between the old building and the new that the idea of your architecture lies. And sometimes it makes me feel, at least at its best, like it's a conversation between the generations. And you do not expect a young child talking to his grandfather to say the same things the grandfather says. you expect them to have different things to say and not always to be entirely, they're not reflecting each other's comments and viewpoints of the world, but they nevertheless feel very connected to each other and influence each other in certain ways.
Well, I'll give you an example. In the San Francisco building, what was protected is the facade, the City Beautiful facade, which is beautiful. But what I decided is to keep the entire volume of the building, because I thought the whole electrical power station was really the memorable aspect, not just the facade. And I really went to great effort to preserve all the walls so that the insertion of that high, that sort of affirmation of new life would be based on the structure that was already there. And I think this is part of memory. If memory is to be heated, it has to be engaging. It has to be reopened, sometimes critically, but it has to be reopened without sentimentality, without nostalgia, and in my view also without the kind of automatic, this is the context, let's just keep it just, you know, preserve it in formaldehyde, you know. So yes, that's my attitude.
I make the analogy to different generations, which sometimes clash, but nevertheless love each other and depend upon each other in a way.
Well, every era is different. And every era demands a certain consciousness, but that does not exclude the fact that memory is the key, because without it, we would not have really directions. We would not know where we have come from. We would not know where we are going. And I think architecture that neglects memory, and by the way, I don't mean memory here as a footnote, but as really the fundamental structure of my work. It's not just an addition, let's have memory, like in the postmodernism, let's put a pediment and call it, you know, memory. No, memory is this greater sense of attachment that requires really grand effort, and grand effort architecturally. You know, to build in Berlin, you know, into the underground, to go below the foundations in this watery soil of Berlin was a really technical feat. It's not easy to do it, but I thought only by going into the foundations can you really sense what happened in the darkness of that foundation. What happened in Germany in 1933? What happened to the, you know, subways, which were paved with stones from Jewish cemeteries, and so on and so on. So I really wanted to reach that depth, and I think that's part of the message that you feel, even if you don't know much about the history of Berlin, you sense that you are deep down in this world.
Yes, I felt. I mean, I want to talk about Berlin because it's such an extraordinary story, but it is also dependent, I think, on your belief that there are certain visceral ways in which we respond to certain kinds of space, right? I mean, and I know neuroscientists have increasingly been discovering that we have certain natural reactions to certain kinds of space. And it felt to me as I went through that you were putting us through an experience that you wanted very much to evoke a potent emotional response. It was not simply an intellectual.
Well, you're right, but let's think about it. Much of architecture has been a very abstract thing just for the head, you know, certain abstract relations and so on. But the human being, and there is that Yiddishkeit again, is complete. It's the soul, it's the emotion, it's your legs, it's what you think, it's what was behind you. It's everything that is part of what we consider being human. It's not Aristotelian. It's not the human being is the rational animal. Not at all. The human being is a complex being. And part of that is to rediscover the sense of space, which is not just for the mind, but it's for the human being as a whole. It's a synesthetic idea that it's your eye, your ear. For example, in the Jewish Museum, I used the acoustics, as I did in other projects, as a main orienting element, because, you know, our sense of orientation is in the ear, inner ear, not in the eye. So it makes a lot of sense to delve into really the human being in terms of the complexity and the wholeness, rather than isolate the dimension of just you know, the brain, the left part or the right part, and so on.
Because one feels certainly in Berlin, also in San Francisco, the idea that the building must be an emotional experience, or it has no purpose, really, or it has limited purpose. I think.
This is a beautiful thought that comes to me from Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great Yiddish writer, who said, "We have free will, we have no choice." We have free will, we have no choice. Right. That is such a beautiful encapsulation of the human being. We have both necessity and freedom in part of our lives, and in the architecture as well. There's necessity, there's gravity, there are windows, there are doors, but there is also freedom to sense space and send yourself into other realms. And I think that's what I love about architecture, that it can communicate that sense of wholeness, more than just a vector, which is one-dimensional.
Is the sort of intensity of experience that you seek in a building like the Jewish Museum in Berlin something that should be reserved for buildings that people experience only occasionally, a special visit to a museum, or does it have an equivalent in a home, in a house, where people are in that space every single day?
Well, it's a beautiful question, Paul. I've struggled with this because I'm building, sometimes hundreds of apartments or thousands of apartments. And my question is this: have the architects been really correct in considering people just a statistic, door number 1, door number 2, door number 3? No, or is there some way to customize each place, because each place is physically in a different position in space? Right. So my attempt, even in a massive housing project, is to take the liberty to alter somehow and give identity to the differences between different positions, of an apartment. And I think that's a struggle. Of course, a museum of history is different from a house, but I don't think memory is only applicable to museums. On the contrary, I think everyday life is where we need that memory to enhance and to affirm that it's about life and freedom that we are here, and not about just being forced to be in a box.
And the notion that you've just raised about a very, very large apartment or residential complex, making sure that the units feel different and distinct as the people are different and distinct, and are not simply, one of 1,000 identical units.
Exactly, and it's very hard to do. I have to say, I understand why Mies van der Rohe and all the modernists did one floor and they just repeated it, X number of times, because it's much easier. It doesn't cause any problems. But if you want to, as I do, to really give affirmation to individuality, and the individuality is necessary, not only because people are different, but because their space is different. Even if you move just, a few feet away, you're in a different position in light, in gravity, in your view. So I do struggle to bring identity and kind of customization to even massive number of different units that deserve it. I think everybody deserves to be recognized.
Well, how does that happen? I mean, if you are doing a big apartment building for a real estate developer, are they responsive to this idea? How do you differentiate units?
Well, you have to balance the the rationality of the system, but you can alter the position of a window. That might sound very modest, but it's very major. When your window is your window, it's not somebody else's window, it's your view. Nobody else, on the floor up above or below. And I've done this in altering even, the way the apartments grow in a curve. Let's say in Singapore, or here, this is a public housing project in Stuvesant, a NYCHA project. Again, giving a different sense to different parts of the units. And by the way, altering even the units as much as I can. The atrium, give everybody a sense of variety. Of course, there's got to be a balance. It's not easy to do, but I do believe in it.
There's another factor there, I would think, in the issue of housing, which is this. Get back to my earlier question about museums versus housing. There's a difference between foreground and background architecture, and someone's house that they're in all the time and see every day and surrounds them in every moment, one would think has also an expectation that it recedes a little bit, in the same way that, I mean, you could love Beethoven, but if you listen to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony all day, every day, you would go crazy. I mean, kind of intensity of artistic experience that you can't experience at every moment. That's what.
Well, look, this is my thought, that habit is the shackle of the free. Habit is, you're imprisoned in that freedom. And my architecture strives to say that nothing should be just habitual, because habit is forgetting where you are, forgetting who you are. So even in what you call background architecture, and that image that I showed before is, by the way, the lowest cost housing in New York City. It's a low cost housing. This is not a luxury building. This is public housing. But it's not true that you have to put everybody in a box. It's not true that the box is the cheapest thing you can ever build. It's not true that you cannot recognize to a democracy the rights of individuals. And I think we have seen in our time the attack on democracy. We have seen an attack here in our country of a kind of fascist uprising, and a leadership that not only tolerated it, but a president who willfully created a kind of autocratic sense of fascism in this country. That's not what architecture is about. Architecture is about freedom. It's about equality. It's about giving people a chance of individuality. And I think, I'm not speaking abstractly, but that building or any other building that I try to work on has the sense of pluralism, differentiation, individuality, and is based on the democratic sense of being. It's not about the housing blocks in Soviet Union or where I grew up in Poland or in China, where just things are kind of going on and on the same way. You have to find some axis or some Archimedean point in which you could turn this economic formula or political formula into and individualize it, make it democratic. That's the idea.
I think pluralism is the key thing here, to use a word you just used a moment ago, which reminds me, I'm sure that you, like so many people in the world of architecture, were appalled at the attempt by the previous administration to mandate that all federal buildings be designed in the classical style.
Oh my God! Really, I use the word fascism in this country, not really metaphorically, but I sensed, I saw it before. That's what happened with dictators. That's what happened with fascists. Tell everybody how to walk. Tell everybody how to march. Tell them how to look at the world. Tell them what is good and what is bad. Give them no freedom. I think this is what appalls me about our time, because history perhaps doesn't repeat itself, but it really echoes in similar ways. And I think one of the basic facts about architecture that I do, it could not be done without democracy. I couldn't, accept, do it this way or else you don't get the job. Okay, so I won't get the job, so I will not do it. But I am appalled by the dictatorial, autocratic, fascistic ideas that the whole, part of this country has. And it's a sad and dangerous development, especially to someone who has looked into what happened to intelligent countries, like Germany before 1933, which, had Schiller, Goethe, and Beethoven, a great culture, and how on a moment's notice, people could just turn it off and process people into the crematoria. So that's the era we live in, and we have to fight against it as much as we can in every way, in every profession.
Yes, and in fact, while the classical architecture order was relatively minor in terms of larger public policy issues, it was a very useful reminder that those of us in the world of architecture could not say this is not our problem. This is, in fact.
That's right. Well, look, if you look at the former president's golden toilet, you'll see the difference. And my parents, I grew up in a, in a working class background. I didn't come from a rich family. My parents were factory workers here in sweatshops of New York. So that's my background. I didn't grow up, designing a house for my uncle, or somebody else. I grew up in a housing project, where I lived in the Bronx. And I think that also is part of my identity. Call it Jewish identity, call it American identity or New York identity. It's part of how I see the world, which is not seen from the perspective of just sitting up somewhere and looking down, but being part of, the working people who work so hard to make ends meet and to try to move their families to education and so on and so on.
And the difference, of course, is that now that you have been extraordinarily successful, you do not see it as, you have made it and you can slam the door behind you, but quite the opposite, I think. You continue to be politically enlightened and eager to see society continue to be more democratic, more pluralistic, more open.
And it's not only in the words, it's in the buildings. I'm building a project in Long Island for elderly people, market housing, projects that are really not the expensive project and not the luxury project, which I've had a good fortune to do as well, but projects for regular people. And I think that's important because with this income inequality, cities are dying. We are creating cities, ghettos for the rich and ghettos for the poor. And I think the cities will die unless we are able to address the social injustice of that kind of relationship. So it's not just political in ideology or in thought. It's really about practical. How do you take a NYCHA project in New York, public housing, and create something that is really interesting, that gives people dignity that they deserve? It's green, it's sustainable, it uses good materials, and it is different than the blocks that are standing built in another era before it.
We've touched on that NYCHA project for a while in a couple of ways. Let's talk head on about it for a moment, because we hear so much today about the horrendous problems of New York City Housing Authority, NYCHA, and also of the loss of the vision that motivated the creation of these many public housing projects in past generations. And yet here you are, having actually built one very recently and done it in an original way that somehow, despite all of the constraints, financial and political both, seems to have been built. Can you tell us a little bit about the story of it? How did it come to be?
Well, there's always a possibility. There's a call for, entries. Build a housing project for NYCHA. It has a low budget. It says this and this and this. And I thought that's a challenge. Let's take it. Let's not just create, another dull box. Let's analyze the site. Let's bring life to the street. Let's create, a clinic, a health facility down below. Let's create a social space inside of the building, which has an atrium, unusual for this kind of building. Let's create a variety of views that each person in these small units has. Let's create a sense of joy. Let's create a sense of, this is a place that anybody would like to live. It's not some sort of a stigma of, quote, social housing. And I think that's really, I believe, is the ethics of architecture. Because architecture, I think, will die if it's only for the rich. It has to be really for everyone. And I think that's kind of my focus now. I have a number of projects, whether it's market rate housing of this sort, is very important. And I believe in it.
Well, there was such a great tradition of what the Europeans call social housing in this country many generations ago that has faded so much. It is extraordinary to see you as one of our most prominent architects today, not only talking about its importance, but getting something built.
Well, thank you, Paul. We have to remember, I grew up in a housing project. It was Amalgamated Building Number 1, built by the Social Democrats, by progressive people in 1920. It was the first social housing project in the United States, built for the garment workers.
Right.
And it was a walk up. We lived, high up. There was no elevator. Everybody sat on the stoops and on the fire escapes. And yet the life there with, all immigrants, all Jewish immigrants mostly, who came from other parts of the world. And yet the sense that I have of it, it was a community that really lived in joy. They didn't care that they didn't have the elevator. Of course, it was hot. There was no air conditioning. It was very hot in the New York summers. But what was more important is the sense that the people and their lives are far more important than, the sort of the status of a building. And I think that building, which was, a very normal brick building without elevators, taught me a lot about the fact that you don't need to spend a lot of money to have good architecture. You don't need to have just the luxury clients, which are of course fun. And it's fantastic to have, budgets that allow you to do things. But that the small parameters, the tight parameters, look, would a good painting exist without a frame? No. Van Gogh didn't go and try to find another way of painting. He accepted that a landscape is always going to be, a horizontal frame. And a portrait is going to be a vertical frame. And that's architecture as well.
Right. There are obviously certain, and doors go into walls and not on.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
Of course, but I love the idea. I must say, I love the idea that this project you've just completed in Bedford-Stuyvesant might in some way be a sort of descendant of the amalgamated housing in the Bronx.
Well, it's not yet completed. It's just in the way, but it is definitely influenced by my idea of how the neighbors are. It's not just about you going and closing your door. It's about who is next to you. Where is the conversation going to take place? Where are you going to meet somebody and form a relationship? Where is the space that you could have to look at people and engage yourself with them? So I think that's that sense of community that is so deeply embedded also in the Jewish tradition, by the way, because, it's not a tradition about the solitary.
No, not at all. Despite the image of the solitary scholar studying Talmud into the night.
Yeah. Well, what they neglect to show is the rest of the yeshiva, is the hundreds of kids who are fighting and reading and making fun of the rabbi.
Exactly. But I think your question, or really what you're saying here, is really asking the question, what can the architecture do to facilitate community rather than discourage community? That's
right. Or rather than just accept the formula. It's been given to us. That's what's always been working. Let's keep making it work. Ask a question. And, that's also very Jewish, to ask a question. It's also science. Science asks questions. We have science because it's about questionable world. The world can be questioned. It's a wondrous world. Why do architects or people who commission architecture stop asking questions? Why is architecture simply giving a bunch of answers? Where are the questions? So yes, it is something questionable. And I think that's very important. Look, if we didn't have questions, we would not have the vaccines we have today, to help us overcome this pandemic. So questions are fundamental. And I think good architecture, whether it's Renaissance, whether it's ancient, whether it's Baroque, whether it's modern, always raised a good question, about living, about light, about materials, about your neighbor, and so on.
I love the idea that, if I can go back to something we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, about a connection between architecture and Jewish sensibility being through the idea of questions. That, in the Jewish sensibility, there is, at least I was brought up to believe, there was not a certainty of answers. And sometimes the act of questioning is more important. And you were saying, in effect, that is something you carry into your philosophy of architecture as well.
Well, definitely. I think it's a very fundamental Jewish trait, is not to just accept the answer, is to ask a further question. Is it really correct? Is that right? Do you really mean that? Can you go a little further? So yes, a question is followed by a question. And I think that is really, look, Adam and Eve, it starts in the beginning of the Bible. It's a question of the tree of knowledge. Can we taste it? Let's do it. It's a question of what happens after that. But I don't think there's a single story in the biblical text which is not about question. Maybe in the New Testament more the answers are given, but in the old biblical text, it's a whole bunch of questions. The angels and the seraphim and Jacob's leg and Isaac and the story of the brothers and the sacrifice of Isaac. It's all a question, and I think a world that that we don't want to see, that I don't want to see, is a world where an edict has been given to give you all the answers. That's what we see in the way the democracy has malfunctioned, right? Because democracy has shrunk. We are simply asked to elect people who will rule over us. I don't want to just elect somebody who will rule over us. I want to have say in what to do. I don't want just every 4 years say yes or no. I want to have a more democratic, pluralistic society. So that's why I am so disturbed by the marching orders of dictators and right-wing, Republicans who would make us all feel that we are really doomed to an answer that they will give us.
And in architecture, that translates into as we said before, into the order about classical architecture being the only acceptable style.
But if you look at the early classical architecture, if one reads Vitruvius, the oldest text we have, they will explain that the Ionic column is the hair of a woman. They will explain that the proportions relate to proportions of a person. They are not dead items that have been codified. They are beautiful, beautiful forms that are related to human beings in antiquity, in ancient Greece, for example. So that's why I love architecture. Even classical architecture is something that is so beautiful. Don't get me wrong. I'm a great lover of classical architecture.
I am too. It's just that neither of us wants to see it made, ordered as a mandate, as opposed to something that you can be creative in.
Exactly. Well, that's just consumerism. Give us that, take the drawings and just repeat them. And forget about them. That's a misuse, I think, of history, not use of history.
Yes. Actually, I think in many ways, while it masquerades as being respectful of history, it's actually contemptuous of history. Because
it is.
Not treat history with the complexity and subtlety that it deserves. It just thinks it's a simplistic reading of it.
I agree. And I think the other danger that I feel is, we have these fantastic technical means, the computers that can generate, but I'm very disturbed by architecture that is really generated by artificial intelligence. Basically, you press a button and you get, cool forms and wow, and this and that. That architecture leaves no mark on me. I find it as empty-headed as any architecture I've ever seen before, because the computer is a great temptation to forget. It's the great temptation to just manipulate the system to produce, quote, interesting results. But the results are far from interesting, because a year or two after, you realize that this architecture isn't working. It's not, architecture cannot be like a refrigerator or a machine or a piece of air conditioning unit. It's a human embodiment. It's a piece of culture. And without that culture being foregrounded, we will just end up with buildings that take up a lot of space and are interesting for about 5 seconds, and that's it.
So do you still, when you create your work, do you still draw by hand?
Oh my God, I'm very old-fashioned. I only draw by hand. I don't even have a computer. I don't know how to use a computer. I mean, I have brilliant people, colleagues who are so adept, but I still think that the old system of having a pencil in your hand and being able to put something, intuitive in the beginning, but all that is contained in you, in your mind, in your eye, can be translated to something so humble. And I sometimes wonder, how is it that something so humble gave birth to architecture and to cities? Because when I think about it, whatever you draw can be built. If you draw a line, if you draw a circle, if you draw a form, the whole city's built from a drawing. So I've always loved drawing, and I love drawing. I think to me, that's kind of a magic. It's a mystical idea that something drawn by hand can become a living reality and part of a city, a whole city plan.
Right. We are not so far from our adjournment time already. This has felt like 5 minutes.
Oh my God.
We have so many wonderful questions from people in the Zoom audience here. I want to have time for at least a few of them. Several are actually asking, not specifically about architecture, but about your background and why your parents remained in Poland for several years after the war. How did you feel returning there when you did return to Lodz?
Okay, a very interesting question. Well, I returned to a different Poland.
Yeah.
I mean, Poland, I don't recognize that this is the Poland I grew up in. It's a Poland, you know, even though it has, you know, governments that may not be my idea of the best, Poland is a country that has freedom. People can walk freely on the streets. They are not repressed or oppressed. It's a totally different Poland. Now, my parents applied for visas and they received visas from many countries, but we were not allowed to leave. You know, and we were simply not allowed to leave. And we were in Poland till they allowed Jews to leave Poland in the 50s, and we were really on the first train out of Poland. There is a photograph. How ironic! The SS Constitution of the America-Holland line brought me here to New York, and God, my life also changed again because new language, new experience, the wonder of America, which I really believe in. You know, it's not a rhetorical trope to say the Statue of Liberty is about liberty. That's, to me, New York. That's America. It's a country of immigrants, of the poor who came here, who made something better of themselves. So, yes, I think that eternal change of location, being an immigrant, definitely had a lot to do with who I am.
Now, you made one huge change in your life now many years ago when you won the competition for the Jewish Museum in Berlin and went from being a sort of academic architect, paper architect, we could say, to a building architect, and you uprooted your family and resettled in Berlin to get that building built. Then some years later, you won another important competition for the master plan for Ground Zero in New York and uprooted your family again and moved everything here. Can you talk a little bit about, we've talked about the Jewish Museum a couple of times already tonight, but not at all about the Ground Zero project. And there is actually a questioner who asks, is there anything you would have done differently now, looking back, now that 20 years have passed? And the master plan that you devised is effectively executed, more or less.
I walk, you know, when the studio was open every day across Ground Zero, and even now it will come back again. And I think I feel amazing that this project, which started from a sense of what it could be, is so close, despite the fact that, of course, it has so many hands in it, so many people, a proof that democracy works, not top down, but just from the ground up. And the fact that I've been uprooting my family many times is true. Who would ever move to Berlin? When I moved to Berlin, there were no foreign architects in Berlin. Right. They thought it's crazy. Like, why would you ever want to live in this divided city? That was before the wall came down. Why would you ever come here? You know, you're in America. You're in America, and why would you want to? But something really of the place, the genius loci. You know, it pulls you. You want to be where it is. You cannot do it from, you know, in a remote control. And I think, you know, when we came to New York, you know, we had nothing. We moved, you know, with our colleagues from Berlin. A lot of German architects came with us. We entered an empty office. We had no computers. We didn't even know what a computer was because Berlin was not so advanced at that time. But, you know, architecture is like that. You have to believe in it. It's a matter of really faith that what you're doing is not a simulation, but it's a real thing. And of course, you have to struggle and you have to fight for what you believe. And how lucky that we live in a democracy still.
Right. Yes, indeed. I mean, I can say only amen to that, and may it still be true.
Absolutely.
Let me. There's another interesting question that goes to your great interest in music. Does music influence your architecture at all?
Totally. Because when I started, I was a musician. I was a virtuoso till I was 15 or 16, whatever. I think I made more money then than I do now. It's true. But I tell you about music. There are three things that I love about music. Number one, I love musical instruments. They're just the most beautiful works of art. Every musical instrument, whether it's the accordion, the piano, the harp, the trombone, the bass, the violin, they're just gorgeous objects. Number two, music is very abstract, just like architecture, but it's also very precise, like architecture. And number three, it communicates to the soul. It's not just for the brain. It really absorbs you. And of course, to me, music is so close to what I know about architecture, because when you draw, a drawing, it's very close to a musical score. It has codes. It's black ink or pencil, whatever it is, or computer on a piece of paper. And yet at the end, it needs an orchestral performance, which is not you. It's not you who is standing on the stage performing. It's 1,000 other people who are actually playing those instruments and bringing them into harmony. So to me, architecture and music are virtually the same field. Really, I just feel that when I press the key on the accordion and extend the bellows to give a certain sound, it's very similar to the pressure of the pencil on an architectural drawing of a house or something. Very close.
And in each case, they depend so much on both an internal structure that must be right and rational, and yet to be able to touch the emotions at the same time. And
it's true, because there is no approximate music, like there is no approximate architecture. It has to be very precise. Otherwise, you're off key. You're not playing the right notes. And the same thing is true for architecture. And I feel that somehow, I don't feel that I gave up music. I just felt that I changed my instrument.
I love that. Another questioner asked, in fact, what led you to become an architect?
I really don't know. I never met an architect in my life when I grew up. I met, shoemakers. I met people who worked in factories. I had no idea what an architect was, but somebody said, you like to draw, you love mathematics, you went to the Bronx High School of Science. Why don't you try architecture? And I really didn't know what it was. And when I applied to Cooper Union, the committee that interviewed me said, Mr. Libeskind, with your interest in physics and mathematics, you don't belong in our school. You should be going to MIT. But somehow this drew me somehow, and I didn't make a mistake. It's a field that does combine all my interests, drawing, music, painting, society, ideas, human, emotions. So yes, somehow I stumbled upon architecture. It wasn't kind of the early vocation. Music was my early vocation, and yet architecture became what an amazing, wondrous field, and how lucky I am to be in it.
Well, I have sometimes said that architecture is about everything, and I think that's what you're saying, that you responded to that. You wanted a field that in the end could allow you to create something, but also to do a social good.
Yes.
And to be creative, to work within a system, and to challenge the system at the same time, and to leave a mark on the world in a way.
That's true. That's definitely true.
We are just about at the end of our time, but I'll just ask one more question that several different people have asked in different variations, which is advice for students, either young architects or students in general, at this strange and challenging moment. Do you have any?
You have to be very wise to give advice, which I would be afraid I'm not. So it's hard to give advice. But if I was to give one piece of advice, is don't believe everything that is around you. Challenge yourself. Take a step away from the comfort zone. You might for a long time be considered a failure. For so many years, people said, what a wasted education. You were trained as an architect and you do nothing. You just have drawings on a piece of paper. Where is that going to lead you? To maybe an exhibition of your drawing. But no, it's a path. You have to forge a path. So my advice to young people is take the risk. Take the risk. Don't be comfortable. Take the risk, and you will never fail because you will be doing what you love to do. So the path will lead you somewhere. And I always say this, most people say, have a goal and try to get to the goal. But I say better have a path. Take the path. Don't be swung to the left or to the right. Stay on that straight line, and it'll get you somewhere interesting. Who knows where?
If you knew where, then there'd be no point, right?
Exactly.
Right. Daniel, thank you. This has been absolutely wonderful.
Thank you, Paul. It's wonderful talking with you.
Both about architecture and about life, and about how inextricably intertwined they are. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Paul.
Let me give the Zoom floor back to Ari for just a moment to conclude.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you to everyone for being here.
Thank you for everyone for being there. Absolutely.
And ditto on behalf of the museum, and especially a very big thanks to both of you, Paul and Daniel, for giving us a window into your life and work, Daniel, and Paul for being our interpreter here. You both given us a lot to think about. I do want to mention to our audience that support from our visitors and members is what makes everything we do at the Museum of Jewish Heritage possible. So a thank you to those of you who have supported the museum, and we hope the rest of you will consider making a donation if you're able at the link in the Zoom chat, as well as joining us for all of our upcoming programs and events. Daniel, you said a moment ago, challenge yourself, don't believe everything around you. And in addition to being part of your advice as an architect, that's sort of part of our mission at the museum, is to reinforce the lessons of history and especially the dark chapters of history. So it's a beautiful note to end on. And just a big thanks to both of you, and stay safe and take care.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you. Thank you, Paul.
Thanks everyone again.
Thank you.
Special
Thank you, Paul.
Wonderful to see you.